Hi guys and girls, Mike Senior from 2IPSI here. If you're tuning into this video, there's a good chance you already have one of the MOTIV Reflex controllers on your GM vehicle, or you're considering looking into one of the MOTIV GM controllers. What we're going to talk about today is the latest update we have for this controller from MOTIV, and it is a Lambda feedback system for the wideband to feed into the Reflex and give you closed loop control at wide open throttle. So to get to this, you can go to our website. Right here on the front page, you'll be able to find the Reflex controller. Click on that, scroll down, and you can see the latest update here is the Lambda Control has been released. Go down to the bottom, you'll find the Reflex Plus download for supporting files, including Lambda updates here. You'll be able to click on this, it's going to download you a zip file. Once you download that file and you unzip it, you're going to find this inside of it. Basically, it'll be right here. So you'll see a bin file for your map data. Basically, you'll need to run a new bin file, which includes all the data for the Lambda. Next, you'll find a hex file, which will use the bootloader to upload the firmware into the Reflex controller. You'll also see an XDF there and an ADX. Your XDF is your map data in Tuner Pro, and your ADX is the acquisition file for the Tuner Pro, and we'll go into how to load those both here in a second. But first off, we need to start with this bootloader. So I'm going to go ahead and open that folder up. You see an executable here, MOTIV Firmware Bootloader. Double click that, it will open a small window, which I'll bring over here, and it shows that the device is not detected. Essentially, you need to have this software open before you power up the Reflex controller. So have this window open, you need to connect the USB to your laptop, and then when you power up the controller, it will immediately hop into there, say device attached, connecting, and device is ready. At this point, we can open the hex file we need, which we'll click right here, and we'll open that hex file. Once we have that hex file open, then we simply push this erase, program, and verify device. Now that that's underway, it'll take about 10 seconds for this to happen normally for it to roll through this. It'll erase it, it'll write it, it'll verify the device. Once it's all done verifying, it says it's completed successfully. We can unplug or reset. So we'll close this. I will go ahead and power off the box that's here on my desk so we can see, so we can wait for that to shut down. Now, we have those other files we spoke about. What we're going to do is we're going to hop over to the Tuner Pro, and we're going to start with the basics here, which is going to be load those files we need. So we'll start with the XDF right here. We're going to say select XDF, and then we'll grab that Lambda there. We'll go to acquisition, load definition file. We'll grab that ADX, put that in there, and then same thing with the file here. We do file, open bin, which it's actually already open here, but open the bin, and it will be the bin file right there. So once we have the 3 files loaded into our Tuner Pro, we are now ready to move forward with this new version of the software. The one thing you will notice right down the bottom here, we're going to go ahead and connect. Oops, I don't have it turned on. We'll turn it on. There's always this delay here in the beginning, and the reason for that is that's basically when that bootloader is able to connect to the box instead of us connecting to it through the Tuner Pro here. So it'll take about, generally for me, it takes about 10 seconds. I have to wait for it. Generally hear it beep, and then you can push the button and it connects. So at this point, I do see at the bottom, I'm Reflex Plus 5.0. If you're one of our previous users, your version down there will be 4.99. So switching to the Lambda now, the Reflex Plus should be version 5.0. So that will let you know your firmware was successful. You have the stuff in there you need to have. So next off, we'll just do quick exploration here. I'm going to just show you some of the changes that have happened. The one thing you will know is that some of the values and things like that are cleaner. We did clean up some of the interface a little bit on these ADX and the tables as well. So you'll find some things that changed in the table arena. We'll start here. Actually, let's start at the top. Close these tables, go right to the scalars here. So open the scalar values. Some things have been slightly renamed. Nothing's really moved. So everything that you're familiar with previously, or if you're setting up the first time, watch our initial setup video. That's going to be important for you to have before you go through this video. But I'm assuming you've already been set up. You have a basic operating system here that works for your fueling needs. Most of the changes you're going to find are down here at the bottom. Lambda Control, on and off, and warm up. And you can see it's a little pop-up there shows us 0 equals off. That means Lambda's turned off, and I'll open that up just so we can see it is indeed shut off in this initial bin that you have. And then greater than 0 equals on. Warm up delay of 1 to 255 seconds. So 0 means this is turned off. You put a number in here for how long you want it to delay when it turns on. So for me, and I'm running an Innovate wideband O2 sensor, and yeah, I didn't cover that as well. So you can pretty much use any wideband system that you have, whether it be a gauge, whether it be just one of the in-cable ones. It just needs to have a 0 to 5 volt output from the wideband. And that 0 to 5 volt output will connect into the input number 3. We do have the newer boxes now will ship with a connector in it that will let you plug into that input number 3. And if you have an older box, we'll get those added to the website in the next couple days here, so you can get a connector if you need a connector with a pigtail on it to plug into the input 3 that's on the box. So once the wideband's connected, you basically have to set that up. We'll do that in the tables. But to turn on the Lambda Control, this is the first value here. For me, I generally use 15 seconds. I found that my wideband, if it's cold and the car starts the very first time, the wideband will take about 15 to 16 seconds before it becomes active. And this 15 seconds starts when the engine RPM begins. So you can turn the key on, maybe your wideband already warmed up. What I've found pretty much every time, even if I stall the car and I start the engine again, it will put the wideband back into a reboot loop, which will cost us about 15 seconds. So we need about 15 seconds to make sure we have an active wideband working before we try to do any closed loop feedback. So that's the value I would put into that one to start with, and everyone's different. You'll have to just log some data and see how that works for you. This is your minimum limit. We'll go ahead and open that up. I currently have it at negative 20%. So that's the amount of correction you're going to allow the wideband to have onto your fuel system. The max limit is here. That's set at 20%. So you have a negative 20 to positive 20 is where I'm running right now. We'll look at some data in a minute. Generally, I don't need that much. Your tune's probably closer than that already. And as you get better, as your tune gets closer and you finalize your values to get it as close to lowest value you can, then you want to reduce these. Maybe you have it -0 and positive, 20%. You could let it add fuel. I would definitely not let it take fuel out once you feel you have a pretty good tune in it from that standpoint. So we have a sensor filter here for your Lambda sensor. 0 means no filter. Basically, everything's running right through it. And you can go up in values. It's an averaging filter across a couple of units. So if you put 1 in there, it'll cut the noise down about in half. You can go 2, 3, 4. Find something that still has good response and is clean with your filter. With the Innovate I'm running, 0 works perfect. I don't need any filter whatsoever. But we did add it in case you have a sensor that seems to be a little bit noisier or something like that needs some filtering. Sensor 2, it's already in here, but this is active for our dual channel Lambda, which we'll release in a few more months. Right now it's just a single channel, so you only need one wideband connected to control all 8 injectors. The integral zone minimum and maximum, these are just preliminary set at -50. They're not a huge factor normally because we don't have a lot of integral control dialed into this right now. But these are nice limits to have should you get any sort of integral windup. If you don't know what I'm talking about with integral, you probably don't need to worry about these, so they're not that important. The next terms are below it, which are already preset here. The lambda for the proportional term I have set here at 1.5. So if you are not familiar with PID loops at all, these values are probably fine for you to start with and just get running with. It'll take a little bit longer for your system to converge to exactly the right lambda, but this lambda proportional term, of course, depends on the percentage of port injection you're running. So if it's a pretty small amount, then you need to have a bigger lambda term. I'm only running in the one test I'm using is only using 30% port, so a value of about 2.2 to 2.5 in here works pretty well. If you think about it, we're only controlling, if I'm doing 30% port, that means we're only controlling a maximum of 30% of the fuel that's being delivered to the engine. So normally a proportional term of 1 is the correct value here, of actually 0.9 is what you'd normally run if you're doing closed loop on a full fuel system. So like we had control of all the injection. But in this case, we're only controlling the port injection side. So we have to be a little bit higher in our proportional term. So when the error is big, we need to add more fuel because it's got to fix 100% of the fuel using only 30% adjustment. So if you're running 50% port, 1.5 is probably a really good number for that. You might have to go down a little bit. Like I said, if you're down at 30%, I would use a 2.0 in here. But there are things you have to work on. The integral term is next. That's right below it here. Integral, again, I have it set at half because you're only doing a smaller proportion of the fuel. And these are terms you want to keep smaller. The integral should definitely be between a half and down to a quarter. So 0.5 down to 0.25 if it's got too much control with that way. So there he is, but the settings are in here will generally work pretty well for most people right off the bat. So that should get you started. Derivative term, we're not even going to worry about that. That should be 0, and I don't see any reason to need that in a Lambda control system. So they're the basic control items we have here for the Lambda control under static states. From there, we'll move on to the tables. There's nothing in flags you need to worry about. In tables, so the one thing right off the bat they changed is the stoichiometric air-fuel ratio. In these new XDF files, the stoichiometric used to be a number of like 1300. Now it actually has the right decimal places. So I've had a chance to go through. We've had to get MOTIV to readjust some of that and get these values to the correct values. So it's 14.7 down to 9.0 at 100% E. This is your increase in E, which is a important value. Just you'll notice some differences there. If you used to have 1470 in here, it should be 14.7 now, just with this new value. The next item we're interested in right here would be our power enrichment throttle threshold. So this throttle threshold will essentially trigger, along with a couple other items in the background, will trigger when you want this to go into closed loop. So this power enrichment threshold, throttle threshold, needs to be pretty much the same or higher than what you have in your E92. I think in my E92 I have them both set at 60% right now. Maybe the E92 is at 50 and this is at 60. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's very close. But as long as this value is higher than the pedal threshold in your E92 with HP tuners, that will be the correct value for you to use. The next one's important is power enrichment percent. See now there's two power enrichment values here. We have a percent and we have a lambda. They're actually the exact same value. They're just two different ways to display it. If you change either one of these, it will change the opposite one. So I've opened percent right now. This is the way power enrichment is shown in the E92. So when you go to HP tuners, you'll see, values like this, 1.18, 1.05, 1.0 if you want stoichiometric. So up until this power enrichment point, this throttle threshold, the reflex will run at stoichiometric until you command a higher power enrichment value. In this case, I have 1.18. The reason for that is because if I go to my lambda table, this is my commanded lambda. So this power enrichment not only commands the fuel that you want to add to the system as you go into wide open throttle conditions, it's also going to command your closed loop feedback. So if you want 0.85 or 0.80 lambda to be commanded for your closed loop feedback, that's what you put into these values. So down at 1000 RPM, I run a little bit leaner. I'm a little richer at 2000. Then by the time at 3000, I'm in full power enrich mode. So here we're running at 0.85, which is, for me, it's around peak power. If we were to say, let's change these values from 4000 up to say 0.80 lambda, we'd put that in there. 0.8 lambda there, I push the save value here, and if I go back to the percent, now we see, our power enrich is now at 1.25. So they interact with each other. If you could change one or the other, whichever one you're more comfortable with, it lets you put the value in there. So I'll put my 1.18 back in there, We'll go ahead and save that. And we've seen lambda, now we're back to 0.85. So the important part is this is what the system's going to shoot for. When you go into closed loop, this is the value of lambda it's going to try to attain. So that's those two items there. Finally, at the bottom here, we have two more tables. We have a lambda sensor voltage, and that is the voltage that your output has from your lambda sensor. It's 0 to 5 volt is the maximum you can go, 0 to 5. You could dial this in closer if you wanted to, maybe do 1 to 4 depending on what your ratio are, but I'm using an Innovate, I think it's an LC2, and that has a 0 to 5 scale on it. And then of that 0 to 5 scale of voltage, the scaling is here. It goes from 0.5 lambda at 0 up to 5.0, and at 5.0 it's 1.5. So I basically did that. I extrapolated between, did the, basically went from the width of it, because they only gave these two values within the instructions with the Innovate. You can always just go ahead and interpolate X, push execute, and of course the values didn't change because that's what was already in there. But that will help you get through there. So you need to put your curve in here for the specific wideband you're using. This one's an Innovate. They might be different if it's an AEM, if you're using an NTK. I mean, there's different varieties. You'll have to check the instructions that came with that specific wideband controller that you're using to get the values for here. Once you have that, that's pretty much all we need to do to set up for the Lambda sensor. We also see there's a dry nitrous adder. It's another item we've added in here, and it's the dry nitrous adder only works when you're in only when you're running in when you're running in port mode, but generally you're always in port mode if you're wide open. So if you wanted to do some additional fueling or trimming of the nitrous, if you happen to be a person running that, you have an option to do that here. Any particular questions on that, feel free to give us a call. We can talk more in detail in that way if there's a reason for it. So hopping into data, what does this mean? So we've rearranged some of the items here under the lists. So under the all GM data, you're going to find the MAF input and engine speed, manifold pressure, ethanol percentage, your pulse width commanded, all usual stuff. Your injector statuses are down here now, a little further down, and we've kind of just cleaned up some of the stuff that you didn't need in this list. The next list is called PID Tuning. That's where you're going to find your Lambda important stuff. So your Lambda PID tuning, you could see here in this particular log I have open, it has a 15 for Lambda, which is my time turning on. The Lambda is in running state, which means it is turned on, and in this particular case, it is in operation, it looks like, because I see 0.84 was my target Lambda. The Lambda sensor is reading 0.82. The correction the Lambda is making is 5% fuel. So it's pulling 5% of fuel out of my MAF curve to achieve the Lambda it's looking for. It's only used in proportional right now for this. I have no I or no D being reported. So we have a half of, which is the inverse of this basically, the Lambda correction. And then all our pulse widths we have shown. First one after the MAF calculation. The next one is the MAF calculation plus my power enrichment. After that, this would show if I was any sort of nitrous enrichment, it would show right here. Pulse width after Lambda correction. So it was pulling out 5%, so it brought me down to 5.6 on pulse width. And then after throttle cut. Throttle cut is basically, there is some throttle cut in here. If you lift the throttle, when you shift, it turns the port injection off during that period and then brings it back as soon as you open the throttle again. And then your final pulse width commanded can be shown there as well. Let me see if we go to switch to a screen here that shows us where we're at. This kind of is one of the screens. You'll find that a lot of the stuff has been updated in here from a feature standpoint to be able to see. Axes are now labeled. We have throttle position. We have MAF. Any of the values you add or take out of the list here, you can add stuff to each board. So these are both treated separately. The top plot is one that you can add any value to. And if you right click on the bottom plot here, that does the same thing as well. We can add or subtract any terms we wanted to out of this. So with that being said, let's look at some data here. We'll see. So as we're running, we see the actual Lambda here in green. On the right here, I see an actual Lambda, and then a Lambda correction in red. Lambda control status. We have a 1 shown right down here where I'm at. That 1 right there tells us that the Lambda has the Lambda sensor is warmed up. That means it went through its 15-second warm-up period, which if this was still in warm-up, this value would be 0. And then when this value shifts to 2, it'll tell us when we actually went into closed loop. So we'll show you over here, there's a better pull here, so to give you an idea here where we're at. So here's some data rolling through. Essentially the throttle was rolled into here. You see the throttle position up here, the 82%, and that is the actual throttle position from the GM. It's the one coming out of it's the engine throttle, not the accelerator position. You can also plot accelerator position, which is your foot pedal, but this is the actual throttle on the engine that is operating here. So it didn't open immediately. It kind of rolls up, and then it hits wide open at about 3,600 RPM there. Of course, what happened when that did, there's wheel spin here, so this was probably a second gear or third gear hit, and it just blew the tires away. So then when we got a gear where the tires can actually stay attached, we got wide open here, and you can see it basically wants to get itself down to the control as fast as possible. So throttle's open, we see the down here, we see the pink line, which is our status, go from 1 to 2. That means we are now in closed loop control. Our error is shown in red, and our target lambda is shown in the light blue, because you see over here, I see a target lambda, and then essentially target lambda jumped right down to 0.84. It's reporting here in the data log. We can see our actual lambda was 0.9 right there, the green, and then it dropped down to 0.81. So it was a little richer than I needed to be, and that's what it told me, is pulling fuel out. And you could see it's subtracting 9% fuel right there at that point, whereas it was too rich. Here it dropped back to 5% as we start reaching some convergence, and 4, 5, 4, 2%. So here my curve is pretty close up here. Only 2% pulled out, and we're matching our target pretty well. Generally, if I'm within 0.2 of what my target's going to be, I'm probably going to call that close enough. But that's up to you. You can play with the P and the I terms to get that pulled even any closer if you wanted to. And generally, I want to be as close as I can. So that's how it hits here. And you can see it just continues on until I was at 5,800 RPM there, and I'm ready to lift. So I can go back now and look at my MAF curve and say, all right, I could see down here at this point right here, I was at 9,600 Hertz, 9,657 Hertz. Actually, I can go back a little further right here. I was at 94, 96. It was taking out 9% fuel right there. So I had too much fuel. So I would go into the MAF curve, and I can lower the amount of airflow it reports, and that I would say I would go maybe 5% there. It actually is doing 9, but I would go a little slower into it and get that closer there. In these areas here, minus 2%, it's probably fine. But you can see how it quickly pulls into where it needs to be and goes on this the quick run there. So as you roll through stuff, like I said, lambda corrections, you can turn things on and off depending whatever else you want to see here. If you want to see the pulse widths on top of each other, I'm not showing a pulse width here. I do have a pulse width there. The pulse width I'm showing up here is the final pulse width commanded. If I want to see the one just after the MAF calculation before the power enrichment, I can turn that on, and you can see there's my 530 to 6. If I want to see what the power enrichment did, there's the power enrichment right there, and you can see where I was 6.5 commanded pulse width, and it dropped it down to 5.4 with the closed loop feedback to get that pulled into place. So a lot of different things and different ways you could look at the data here. You'll find that it is cleaned up a bunch. The one thing I've learned using this Tuner Pro a little bit is after you go ahead and run some data, I find it better to save what you recorded and then reopen that log again. So basically going up to acquisition here and saying close the log file and then loading log file again. As soon as you do that, it kind of plots the whole log out nice for you. You can scroll through the log real easily back and forth. And depending on where you're at, you could look at different stuff. You could zoom in tighter or closer to see what you're looking for. And yeah, I'm sure a lot of you guys will have questions. You feel free to let us know. We'll be happy to see if we can answer anything for you, and if not, if we can't do it, then we can always get in touch with the right people at MOTIV to get any questions or anything answered. And we hope this makes your trip through the port injection on your DI GM even more enjoyable. So Stay tuned. Like I said, dual wideband will be coming out shortly. Single wideband's what we're releasing right now, and we probably have a few months here before the next one comes out. And there are some other features that we'll be dropping with that as well. So stay tuned with us, and we look forward to seeing you at the track.